That's the late bell. Let's get started. I'm your host, John Phillips, and today I will be joined by Gerald Dessus, a social justice educator in Philadelphia. But first, our do now for today is to hit that subscribe button. Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, make sure that you're getting the late bell there too. We are putting out a lot of great content on Twitter at Late Bell Pod, so if you want to stay up to date on all the latest conversations, follow us there, as well as me at By John Phillips. If you enjoyed this episode and feel motivated, share this episode on all your social media platforms, email it to a teacher you used to have, or play it too loudly on the subway so that the person next to you hears. We're working to shift the manner in which education is talked about in this country, and every conversation helps. And with that, put 3 minutes on the clock where I will give you a brief overview of why we're talking about social justice today. Black boys being harassed and murdered in cold blood by police. Girls having governments tell them what can be done to their bodies. Members of the queer community dreading going to school because of administration's inhumane policies. Once upon a time, the idea of education as a social good was paired with the idea of preparing children to grow up to be strong members of American society. We taught history and civics classes that propagated a white, elite male history and that promoted a complacent, obedient civic body that accepted the status quo through truisms regarding fairness, justice, civility, and the American way. Injustice, inequalities, and inhumane actions and policies have been a staple of American society since its invention. But for centuries, those in power were in such control of every lever of our country that the narrative never shifted fully. Even after a civil rights movement in which white people sprayed black protesters with tear gas and fire hoses, even after the beating of Rodney King, a black man in Los Angeles, by white police officers who faced no consequences, and even after slavery and Jim Crow and mass incarceration and workplace harassment and college date rape culture and toxic masculinity and Stonewall and Don't Ask, Don't Tell, we've still hung on to this lie that the great American experiment was great for all. With the culmination of the rise of the internet and social media, and of an increased awareness of the inequalities that exist in our country and the work still left to do, as well as a reconceptualization of what it means to be an American that has a lot less to do with civility and much more to do with fighting back against corruption and hate, as well as speaking truth to power. In the last 15 years, Americans on the whole are much more cognizant of the social injustices that exist. And unlike the lie that was sold to many in many classrooms across America that social justice isn't related to our policies, laws, and practices as a society, we are now very much aware of the intersectional nature of sexism, racism, homophobia, and pay gaps and wealth gaps and housing policies and the like. And that's why it's time for us to reconceptualize the way we think about teaching history, government, and the like. And that's why I'm so excited to bring on Gerald Dessus, a social justice educator and curriculum designer in Philadelphia. Gerald, thank you so much for coming on with me.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So to start off, at its most basic, what does a social justice curriculum feature?
So I think when we think of social justice, we think of the distribution of wealth and opportunity in our country and our society, right? When I think of a social justice curriculum, I think of the process that we take to get there, right? The process to equity, and how do we prepare students or any participant for doing that work, that activism work. So in my practice, what I found is that there are 4 main components of a social justice curriculum. That varies from identity to justice work, right? Unpacking stereotypes and privilege and oppression, discrimination, bias. The other 2 would be diversity and action. And so I pull from those standards and those aspects to build the framework that I use. But what I've often found is that with most social justice educators, there's a lot of heavy lifting in terms of content, and there's not enough practice. So what I've tried to do in the past 3 years is include that practice piece so that students are understanding what social justice means and what activism looks like, but they're also practicing that work. So if they decide to continue that in high school, they already have that experience of what it feels like and what it should look like.
Which is really incredible. And I agree that it's when you think about the content work, that is at once like the first touch point of how people can get into this type of education and this type of work. But in terms of long-term impact, you need that practice to be able to really have the long-standing effects that we need social justice curricula to have.
Absolutely. And, you know, the beautiful piece in this is that over the past 3 years, I've seen students grow in terms of their racial identity, in many aspects of their social identity or identity overall, right? But we're not just sending them into high school with a strong sense of self. We also want them to understand that there is purpose and there's this higher calling in terms of leading and serving in their community. And that's what we're pushing them to do. We can talk about it all we want, but if they don't have that practice, then I feel like there's a huge void in the course. And so most times when I look at professional developments or I go to trainings around social justice, we're missing that practice piece.
And when we think about practice, what it also really does nicely is it activates a fire in students.
Oh, yes.
And I know that for me, one of the biggest components that I spend a lot of time on is, 'cause I taught 10th grade last year and I'm going to be teaching 11th and 12th next year, is recognizing that, I have kids that are in high school that don't have things that they're necessarily passionate about. And so when you name those different components of social justice curricula, what I think of is you're also giving students the tools that they need to know themselves and the tools that are required to take that knowledge of self and enact it in the world. And so it's really, really awesome to hear you talking about how your goal is to get kids to high school and beyond with those skills to really put themselves out there in a confident and impactful way.
Right.
So when we think about social justice as a curriculum and as pedagogy, however you want to name it, there are certain people that I think in education and then also generally, like if they were to be reading a newspaper and they were to read an article about social justice curriculums entering into classrooms, they would say, why is that necessary? We've been just fine doing the standard traditional work for years. So in your words, why is it necessary to be explicit about social justice?
There are a lot of, and I'm speaking about children of color in this in this moment. There are a lot of experiences that our students or my students have encountered prior to their 8th grade year of school, and most times they're not having these conversations at home, and they don't have the vocabulary to associate what they're experiencing with what we know to be true. So every single year in the beginning of the year, we talk about racial profiling, and students they're kind of floored, right? They have that aha moment when we start talking about what it means and what it is. They're like, what? I don't get it, right? That doesn't make sense. And so I give this example of going into a gas station and feeling like you're being watched by the cashier, especially when you go to the back of the gas station and you're getting something to drink and you can see the cashier leaning over the register to watch you. And the entire room just kind of like erupts with, oh my gosh, me too. Like that happens every time. That happens down the street. That happens around the corner. And that's what this course is about in terms of making sure students are exposed to this vocabulary, these experiences that they already have when they go to the mall or when they're out with friends. And we talk about a number of issues, but those are those aha moments that students have, and that's not happening in other classes. I had this conversation with one of my former middle school teachers. We were friends on Facebook, and we were having a conversation about the need for social studies classes. And in a testing environment, those are the classes that are often left supported. They're not updated. Most schools are still using curricula from 10 years ago. And I said that, an interdisciplinary approach is needed, right? But it also shouldn't replace history courses. And to say that teaching a unit on a specific novel that has themes of social justice or themes of racial issues embedded throughout that unit, that's not enough. And that's not the same as explicitly teaching what social justice is and diving into constitutional issues and having students understand what it means to be a citizen in this country. So that way, when they get to high school and when they graduate from high school, they're prepared to go out and be full-blown citizens. And that doesn't devalue literacy, that doesn't devalue math. But if we're truly educating the entire student, the whole child, then we can't leave out that citizenship part, which often happens. I found that most times in high schools, or at least in Pennsylvania, students don't learn about civics until their 12th grade year of high school. Yeah. And by that time, most of them are already capped out, right? They're checked out, they're ready to move on, they're ready for college. And we're doing them a huge disservice.
I agree that a lot of people think that if you just read 2 books by either people of color or your book list, make sure that it checks certain boxes or however you want to think about,
right,
hitting those boxes. And then the same thing happens in history. No, we talked about that. We did one project for a week on it. Instead, I think that what we need to start doing is flipping that approach and thinking, well, if we have a social justice curriculum and we do our due diligence in integrating literacy skills and writing skills and math skills into that, what would that look like? And so that takes the power away from that traditional hierarchy and allows the people who are doing the hard work, like you and all these other really, really strong social justice educators, that would put the power in your wheelhouse rather than trying to find some small area in a traditional curriculum set. So I think that that's awesome. All of the work that you're doing, but also just the view of it, I think is really vital.
I also think people, we tend to think of social justice as just a racial content, and that's not the case. We're missing out on so many other constitutional issues that we never truly talk about in school, and definitely not in a middle school setting. When we're talking about civil liberties, education, discrimination, environmental justice, right, healthcare, legal rights, voting rights. If we give students the content and we scaffold for them, they're truly able to understand and master their understanding of this content. And we tend to shy away from it because we think that students won't get it. So that's one of the biggest the loopholes that I see. And it kind of frustrates me a little when I'm talking to educators and they think just by throwing in the hate you give or other culturally relevant literature that they are teaching social justice. And that's not the case at all.
Right. And it's not even enough to think about it as, oh, well, I'm just taking a first step. It's like, no, this can't be a place where we're doing half measures, because
Absolutely.
The time that we're living in, it calls for severe overhaul of everything that we have traditionally done.
Absolutely.
So I'd love to hear what about your time in education and just your time, on Earth also, because I think our lived experience is as teachers end up deciding a lot of what we value in the classroom. So what about your journey and your path have led you to this work, and how was it for you in the process of working to be able to have a space where you could implement it the way that you really truly wanted to?
So I'll kind of start from my decision to teach. And that really happened. It was a process from like elementary school to middle school. I was always interested in education and the idea of being a teacher, but it wasn't until my seventh grade literature teacher put the I think it's the Bully, and it's a part of the Bloofer series. It's a short novel, and we read it as a class, and that was the first time that I really connected with a character who looked like me and had similar experiences. And from that moment, I was hooked in terms of reading. And I wanted to read everything that was in front of me. It was my way of escaping reality. And by the time I got to high school, I had this notion that how impactful would it be if I could change lives, if I could change paths and trajectories of young black children, like my cousins and my siblings, just by getting them engaged in reading the way that my seventh grade teacher did. And that's why I decided to study teaching. I went to Lincoln University, and as a freshman, we had to take this course called the African American Experience. And wow, it was such an eye-opening experience. The pretty way to put it is that I was lied to
Right.
in elementary school and middle school, as it pertains to social studies and history, period. Um, and there was an entire narrative that was missing in our curriculum in Philadelphia. And I went through this process where I became really angry and frustrated because I felt foolish that here I am, an 18, 19-year-old in college, and I'm having to reteach myself American history, African American history, because textbooks and
Hmm.
past teachers failed to do that. I still decided to pursue literature, and I became an English teacher in Philadelphia, and I spent 2 years at a small charter school. And then I decided to uh, take on a position as a founding teacher of a turnaround network. And within that first year, we had this professional development series called Cultural Context. And I was one of the facilitators, and essentially we would have conversations around stereotypes and biases and privilege and oppression in the classroom, and how we we allow that to manifest as microaggressions as teachers. So we, as a network, we were doing the work of unpacking that and kind of fixing this major issue. And in my head, I'm thinking, you know, we're doing this work with teachers, but who's doing the work with students?
Right.
And I was making the decision to leave that network and join the Philadelphia School District when a principal from another school within the network, Sharif El Mekki at Shoemaker Charter School,
Hmm.
uh, reached out to me and he said, we don't have any literature positions available, but we've been thinking about creating this social justice course and we think that you will be great for it. And I'm like, I don't know. Because most times people see this as an elective and I don't want to have a position for a year. And, at the end of that year, you say that we don't want this course anymore. And I'm now back in the same position. Um, but I decided to take a leap of faith. And that entire summer, worked with a couple folks from Facing History and Ourselves, and our history department at Mastery Charter Schools, and we created this amazing blueprint for this curriculum. And from there, it just kind of took off. So the seed was already planted, especially when I'm thinking about my experience at Lincoln University, but I wasn't truly given an opportunity to teach this course until 2000, I want to say 2016. And sadly, it took a year and a half for the network to realize, wait, we have something powerful in this course and we should be offering this at other schools. So now they're at about 7 or 8 schools who have taken on the social justice course. My goal is to expand that beyond the Mastery network and to other schools.
That's awesome. So I love whenever someone is doing work in the classroom that there's a feeling of knowing that it is good work. Like when you not only when you just have one good class, but when you know that day in and day out that you're making an impact, there's no greater feeling. And so I'd
Right.
love to hear some of the best successes that you've seen from the curriculum so far and just hear a few of those stories.
I spent a lot of time in the beginning of our conversation talking about practice, and I adopted Bobby Harrell's cycle of liberation. So as students are diving into these historical case studies throughout the year, they're also going on this journey of discovering what it feels like to have moments of cognitive dissonance, and then experiencing research where they're choosing different issues that they're passionate about or curious about, and spending about 8 weeks just focused on those individual issues. And then for the second half of the year, we focus on building coalitions. And with those coalitions, creating these blueprints for change. And our first year, we had, with their end of year projects, groups of about 4 to 6 students. They took on a variety of different social justice issues, ranging from police brutality to colorism was one, which I thought was really unique. We had students focus on equity in education, just so many different topics. But what I thought was great was that students were taking on the load, and they were the ones who were sending emails and booking spaces and making phone calls. And I had never seen that in the classroom before. And so that was amazing. There were 2 groups that stood out to me. One group invited officers from the local precinct to come into the school, observe a few classes for the day, and then have lunch with 7th and 8th graders and answer questions about police brutality and the Black Lives Matter movement. And that was so powerful because their mission was to bridge this divide between police officers and children of color in West Philadelphia. And so for them to have that mission as an 8th grader, I was just completely blown away. And they ran everything from the tour to the interviews to facilitating conversations. It was amazing. Another group wanted to have a basketball game between local police officers and students within the school, and they couldn't find a space for the basketball game. So 3 weeks from the due date of the project, they completely changed their mission and their project and started working on something else. And I thought that moment was such a great teaching moment that, this is what activists do. They set out with a goal, and sometimes they have to go back to the drawing board because things don't pan out the way they want them to. So I love these projects at the end of the year. We've also seen great success with students' writing growth. And this was part of the conversation that I was having with my former middle school teacher, is that sometimes we think of history classes as being these hubs where we only talk about content, and that is completely far from my experience. We've done a lot of literacy work and writing instruction as well as reading instruction in terms of reading strategies and how to dissect primary sources and sources from a textbook and news articles. And so we've seen students jump in terms of their writing growth every single year on the state exams as well as our in-network benchmark exams. So that's been a huge blow for me. I want to jump back a little bit and talk about my 10th graders. This is an 8th grade course, by the way. But I had 10th graders who were facilitating our career day this year, and 2 of them were in my room. And during one of the breaks, I should say, one of the 10th graders, she was telling me about her experience in AP courses. And she was like, Mr. Dessus, I'm so frustrated. And I'm like, what's going on? And she said, I'm tired of writing ACQCs. And ACQC is just a standard paragraph with textual evidence, but it's just a method we use to make it catchy and accessible for students. And she was like, we've been writing them since 7th grade. We know how to write them, but they won't give us anything different. And I said, well, have you talked to your teachers? And she said, yes. And we told Mr. So-and-so, and he just said, we'll talk about it, but keep writing. And so I said, okay, well, what did you do next? And she said, well, we tried to talk to Mr. Elmecki because he's the principal, but he told us, he gave us the runaround. And I said, well, who do you think makes decisions in the school? And she said, Mr. Elmecki. And I said, what can you do to get him to listen? And she just paused and was thinking about it. And I said, you have the top 10th graders in your AP courses. Imagine if you came in one day to take, let's say, benchmark exams, and in all of the AP classes, none of you picked up a pencil. Like you refused to take an exam. Yes, he would probably be a little frustrated, but I promise you, he would be over the moon that his students are taking a stand about something they're passionate about. They're fighting for more rigorous education. He would love that, and you would probably get him to listen to you. So the fact that like 10th grade students are thinking about their concerns in a way of not just complaining about it, but how can we make this happen? And we've already tried these action steps. What can we do to take this further? That is, it's just an incredible feeling. So you may not see like the wins that first year or right away, but we're planting seeds. And that goes back to the conversation earlier about, waiting until 12th grade to implement a civics course. If you wait until then, you don't get to see what students can do with these little seeds.
I think that there is a line of thinking, and I think about this a lot as a white male in a space that needs diversity and people that are able to talk about diversity effectively and teach it effectively. But we also need just to be creating a kinder nation generally, right? So I think that there's a line of thinking that the students that need this type of work the most are white middle class students who often are never going to have parents who are rattling at the door saying we need a social justice curriculum implemented, or we need more diversity in our course content, or any of what other places have educators who are actively fighting for those things. So what do you say to that line of thinking? And then what is your pitch to schools that are predominantly white to make sure that they're implementing this type of education for their students?
It comes down to the conversation about windows and mirrors. This course has been amazing and in many ways groundbreaking within the Mastery Network. And I appreciate everyone who's been involved and everyone who trusted the process and decided to take this on in their own schools. Earlier in the year, I decided to reach out to other schools, specifically private schools, to see if there was some way that we could get this work implemented in their curriculum. And the way things worked out, I ended up taking a position at the Philadelphia School, which is an independent school here in the city. And the conversation around social justice curriculum, I thought was so brave and so fearless. Right now, they have a curriculum that solely focuses on the American Revolution and pretty much studying the Constitution for the entire year in 8th grade. How powerful would it be for those same students to, continue talking about the Constitution, but talk about it in a way where they are thinking about ways that they can change some of the issues that are plaguing our society right now, right? When we think about voting rights and we think about some of the issues that are still present in many different states across the country, to get students to think about that and then to also unpack it, to also put together plans to dismantle those issues, to create equity. That would be so powerful. And especially when we're talking about race. We often get frustrated with adults who, specifically white Americans, who are not as compassionate or are unable to empathize when it comes to issues surrounding race. But then I question, what are we doing as educators in schools that are predominantly white, or lacking that diversity? I mean, how many private schools have black male educators on their staff? So the conversation around windows and mirrors is essentially, are we providing windows into other aspects of our society that these students may not be exposed to?
Well, I think that it's such important work wherever it's being done. But I do agree that ultimately, the more diverse the spaces in which these conversations are happening, the higher the likelihood that we will see the change that we so dearly need. And
Absolutely.
so I really thank you so much for coming on and sharing the work that you started at Shoemaker and that you're going to continue on at the Philadelphia School. And they're very lucky to have you. And I really wish you the best of luck in going into the next school year and doing this really vital, exciting work.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you for having me on.
Thanks so much to Gerald Dessus for joining me today on the podcast. You can follow him on Twitter at Gerald Dessus. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with anyone in your life who will listen, and make sure you are subscribed so that you can check out next week's episode on implicit bias in the classroom. That's all for now. Thanks for listening.